Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the Iron Rod and Potter's Vessels. I am Logan Holiday, and this is
Toby Chilton.
We're here for another episode this morning. And sorry about last week. I was gone to children's camp. The youth were gone to Peru the week before that, and so we've been busy. But we're here this morning to talk about some interesting things. First of all, we're going to do a little recap on Sunday's message, which has to do with the book of Revelation. And we covered chapter 6 yesterday, where the seven seals are broken. And this passage is known as the four horsemen of the apocalypse. Now, traditionally, this chapter with the four horsemen has been interpreted as coming from the demonic, such as the one who sits on the white horse in chapter 6, verse 2 is Satan, and then everything that happens in chapter 6 is upon everyone on the earth. And this is God's judgment upon all those who do not place their trust in Christ. But that's a misrepresentation of this chapter, because the background to this chapter is the book of Zechariah. And if you read Zechariah chapter 1, verses 8 through 15, you will see that the horsemen in Zechariah actually come before God. God is the one who sends them out into the earth to take a survey of the land. And in chapter 6, verses 1 through 8, they are called the four spirits who stand before the Lord. And so these horsemen and the riders that are on these horses come from the Lord himself in this chapter. And so when we talked about this chapter yesterday, we talked about how this chapter gives us assurance in the midst of a world that is full of evil and chaos. It does so by chapter 6, verse 2, telling us who is the one who is overcoming and who is conquering. And I believe the one on the white horse is Jesus. Jesus rides a white horse in Revelation chapter 19, verses 11 through 16. And I also believe that Psalm 45, verses 3 through 5, is also seen within this verse, because in that psalm you have the king of Israel who is victorious in battle against his enemies, and he has a bow and he has an arrow, just as the description is for us in chapter 6, verse 2. And where we get this idea of assurance in the midst of a chaotic world comes to us in verse 11. John sees those who have been killed for the word of God and for the witness they had maintained, which means they did not deny Jesus in the face of persecution. And they ask the Lord, how long will it be before he takes vengeance on their behalf? And the Lord, in verse 11, gives them a white robe and tells them that they should rest a little while longer until the number of their fellow slaves and their brothers who were to be killed, even as they had been, would be completed also. And this white robe is, if you put it parallel between those who worship idols who have defiled their garments, this white robe represents purity. It represents the people of God. It's their identity, who they are, and they belong to God's kingdom. So even in the midst of evil and chaos in the world, God has his people. He knows his people, and he will come to avenge his people even. In verses 12 through 17, we see the Lord coming, and as he comes, the kings of the earth, those who are rebellious against the Lord and his people, who have killed his people, are judged. So the Lord will take vengeance. We will be vindicated in that we can have assurance in the midst of chaos. Jesus is currently working on our behalf to subdue evil. He does this through the proclamation of the good news of the gospel. As people turn to the Lord in faith in Jesus, hearts are changed. They begin to love the Lord their God with all their heart, soul, mind, and strength, and their neighbor as theirself. But Jesus will finally abolish evil when he returns, and the evil is judged in this world. Now, that's just a little bit about what we talked about yesterday in Revelation chapter 6. What we're going to talk about this morning, just to transition a little bit, is 8 Bible myths many Christians believe. Now, this comes from a podcast called Misquoting Jesus. And the host of this podcast is a man by the name of Bart Ehrman. Bart Ehrman is a biblical scholar. His specialty is New Testament manuscripts. He was a student of Bruce Metzger at Princeton. And he was the last student of Bruce Metzger. Bruce Metzger was a prominent New Testament scholar, and especially his specialization was also New Testament manuscripts. But Bart Ehrman has left the faith, and so he seems to have made it his goal to, although he would not put it this way, to cast doubt upon the Bible. Did you say that was fair, Toby?
For sure.
Yeah. It seems that everything that he does is just to cast doubt upon the Bible and the manuscripts of the Bible, especially the New Testament. And so on the podcast on July 14th, they discussed 8 Bible myths many Christians believe. And me and Toby want to come together this morning to kind of rebut what Ehrman has said about this. The first myth that Ehrman mentions is that many Christians believe that Jesus is Yahweh. That is to say, Jesus is Lord, like the Lord of the New Testament.
He acted like he was surprised when someone told him that Jesus was Yahweh. Though he wrote a book called How Jesus Became God, right?
He did. Okay. He did. And in that book, he would say that Jesus became God as the centuries passed, that this was a Christian invention, so to speak. It started with Paul, and then it went into the 2nd century, Justin Martyr, and so on and so forth. And this, over time, Jesus became God. But this is something that Peter wouldn't have believed, and this is something that John wouldn't hold to, that Jesus is Lord. Jesus is Yahweh. And so we want to kind of push back on that because we do believe very clearly that Jesus is in fact Yahweh. And Bart Ehrman mentions as kind of a proof text to push back against this idea that Jesus is not Yahweh or the Lord is Psalm 110.
Yeah.
Psalm 110, the Lord said to my Lord, right? Sit here while I make an enemy your footstool for your feet. And that the Lord gives the Messiah this authority. And so therefore, if he receives this authority, he can by no means be Yahweh.
Yeah, but I think there's a couple reasons why, like, you can try to justify his arguments. Number one, like Jehovah's Witnesses, Mormons would say Jesus is a God, right? That's fine. That's what they would say. That's fine because Jesus is a God. He's not the God. And you have to also realize that the God is not God's name, right? It's a title for a spiritual being. In the New Testament, what you don't usually see translated is when it talks about God the Father, it says the God in the Greek. It has a definite article. We don't have that. It just says God, capital G. So that's how we communicate that we're talking about a specific God. But God's name is Yahweh. And in the New Testament, they translate that with the word Lord, which is kurios. And the Old Testament passage he's referencing, it says, the Lord says to my Lord. And so it says, and you'll see this in your Bibles probably, the first Lord is all capital letters. And the second Lord, maybe just the first L not be capitalized. So it's the Lord, which is Yahweh in Hebrew, said to my Lord, Adonai, which is the word for Lord or Master. So there is a distinguish there, but the problem is he's not recognizing something that's, of course, he doesn't believe in Jesus, right? He doesn't believe that God's real. Jesus is both human and divine.
Yes.
And so when we're discussing Psalm 110, we're talking about, and in David's position, the humanness of Jesus. The humanness of the Son of Man, right? So Daniel 7, like the Son of Man, is what he says. Jesus' favorite moniker for himself is Son of Man. If you read the book of Ezekiel, Ezekiel is often called Son of Man, just another way of saying human. So then you have this very human person that's Jesus, but we have to also recognize which even if you say Jesus is a God, that he is also divine.
Yes.
But there's too many things in the New Testament that indicate that Jesus is not just a God, but he is the God.
Yes.
And there's passage after passage that shows that.
It's also a denial of what we believe as Christians. We believe that the Father is Yahweh, that the Son is Yahweh, and that the Spirit is Yahweh.
Yeah, and that's not crazy.
It's not crazy. And this is something that can be seen not just in the New Testament. It starts with the Old Testament, this foundation. And I'm going to go to a passage real quick, and that passage is the book of Genesis, chapter 19. In Genesis chapter 19, this is the famous Sodom and Gomorrah account. And in this account, this is where Yahweh, the Lord, rains fire and brimstone down upon Sodom and Gomorrah as judgment, in the form of judgment. And I want to read Genesis 19, verse 24. And it says, "And Yahweh rained on Sodom and Gomorrah brimstone and fire from Yahweh out of heaven." So in this one verse, we have two Yahwehs.
Yeah.
The Yahweh that is in heaven and the Yahweh that is standing before Lot and his wife and his family, his two daughters.
So how do we have two Yahwehs?
It's the same Yahweh who was standing and talking to Abraham just moments earlier before the city was destroyed.
Yeah.
And so what's this idea of two Yahwehs?
Well, you have to, there's definitely what's called the two powers in heaven kind of idea that we see all the way throughout history of being recognized. And you see Rabbinic Judaism trying to cover it up.
Yes.
But there is definitely 100% a two-person Godhead that's revealed in the Old Testament. Though I think some passages in Isaiah show us the whole Trinity.
Absolutely.
Like when it talks about the Spirit and grieving the Spirit, and we see that in the New Testament, right? And it's like, why did you lie to the Holy Spirit in Acts chapter 5? But yeah, we have to ask, who is this second Yahweh?
Well, it aligns with how we understand who Jesus is in the New Testament, especially in the Gospel of John, the very first chapter. Jesus is the visible image of the invisible God. So, although you can't see Yahweh who is in heaven, you can see the Yahweh who stands on the earth, for he is the one who represents the one in heaven. And so that's how we understand Jesus in the New Testament, and that reflects in the Old Testament.
Yeah, and there are passages where the grammar even of the language, it's like Titus 2:13, that God the Father and Jesus are equated as essentially the same. And then all throughout, you'll see Jesus called Kyrios. Jesus is Lord. And you have to, that's a decision that has to be made,
right,
of course. But are we saying that Jesus is the divine and bears the name Yahweh, which Jesus says before Abraham, what?
Before Abraham was.
I am, right?
I am.
Yeah, so John is very, very clear that Jesus is Yahweh.
But Ehrman would reject that because he
Yeah.
says John is dated real late. John is after 70 AD.
Which he has no proof of that.
No proof of it, but he rejects John. So does Matthew or Mark or Luke consider Jesus to be Yahweh? And I say yes. I've got two passages that I want to read from the Gospel of Matthew that I believe definitely shows that Jesus is the Lord or Yahweh. And the first one is when Jesus walks on the water. Jesus comes to the disciples. They're in the midst of a storm. He walks on the water. He invites Peter to come out with him. Peter does, but gets frightened and begins to sink. Jesus has to rescue him. And after he rescues him, in verse 32, it says this, Matthew 14:32. "And when they got into the boat, the wind stopped. And those who were in the boat worshipped him, saying, 'You are truly God's Son.'" And that word for worship is the Greek word proskuneo, which always in the New Testament, when we're talking about proskuneoing something, this is obeisance to God. This is bowing down to worship. Okay, this is what you would do before God the Father who sits on the throne, right? And then the second place in Matthew, which
There's
is
no prophet, by the way, no being in the
Right.
Old Testament that receives this kind of activity.
not even an angel, right?
No.
When John falls down to proskuneo before angels in the book of Revelation,
corrected.
the angel
Correct.
says, "Stand up, for I'm a fellow servant just like you."
Yeah.
And the last passage in Matthew is Matthew 28, verse 9. This is after the resurrection. Jesus is about to give the Great Commission. And it says in Matthew 28, verse 9, it says, "And behold, Jesus met them and said, Greetings. And they came up and took hold of his feet and proskuneoed him," worshipped him. Clearly, they're worshiping Jesus. And if he's not Yahweh, then they are in violation of worshiping something other than Yahweh.
Yeah. And you can even see, like in the book of Exodus, we have this pillar of cloud and pillar of fire that's representative of the presence of God. That when it's first kind of introduced, it's called the angel of Yahweh, just like at the burning bush. Jesus sees himself as both, right? You can kind of see these relations, the way he uses statements, and particularly John. But even the book of Jude is very important here. Now, this is a contested, contextual variant. But most newer texts of the English are going to adopt that Jesus is the one who led them out of Egypt into the wilderness.
Yes.
That's the word that Jude uses in Jude 5, Jesus. You're older, maybe King James might say Lord.
Yes.
But the textual evidence leans towards it being Jesus, which Bart would say, oh, it's Lord, because you wouldn't have to argue with it.
Well, it doesn't matter, because the verse right before it says that Jesus led the people out of Egypt.
Yeah.
It's talking about they denied who's our only master and Lord, Jesus.
Yeah.
So Jesus is the context of that passage.
Absolutely. And if you go to Deuteronomy, it says, well, who led you out of the wilderness? It says Yahweh.
Right.
So,
But in Exodus chapter 23, it is the angel of the Lord who leads them.
yeah.
Right? And Jude wants to make sure to identify Jesus with that figure. Why? Because the angel of the Lord appears many times. The first time we see not the first time, but one of the times we see the angel of the Lord is at the burning bush.
Yeah.
Moses sees a bush that is not consumed. There's an angel within the bush, but that angel speaks as if he is Yahweh himself.
Yeah, then he turns to
So it is a visible representation of Yahweh.
he turns to Yahweh, right?
Right.
So the argument would be that anytime you see there's a Yahweh in heaven, like we see in the Sodom and Gomorrah passage, and a Yahweh on earth, that this physical manifestation of Yahweh is a pre-incarnate Jesus.
Right.
Is kind of how...
And that leads us to the second myth, right? Because Bart would say that one of the myths that Christians believe is that Jesus secretly appears with Yahweh in the Old Testament.
Yeah.
And we would say, well, that's not myth. That's absolutely true.
Yeah.
And Jude believed that. And even, let's talk about this one we didn't go to, John chapter 12.
That's where I'm going right now.
So in John chapter 12,
Verse 40, 41.
go ahead and read that for us.
Yeah, so he's commenting on Isaiah 6 here, and this is in John, it'll start in verse 39. Therefore they could not believe, for again Isaiah said, He has blinded their eyes and hardened their heart, lest they see with their eyes and understand with their heart and turn, and I would heal them. Isaiah said these things because he saw his glory and spoke of him. Nevertheless, many even of the authorities believed in him, but for fear of the Pharisees, they did not confess it, so that they would not be put out of the synagogue. So
if you're asking Isaiah,
Yeah.
Isaiah, what is it, chapter 6?
Yeah, Isaiah 6.
Yeah. Isaiah, who did you see on the throne? He would say Yahweh.
Yeah.
If you ask John, who did Isaiah see on the throne? He would definitely say Jesus.
Jesus. Yeah, and so, and then part of it, there's a convolution because, I'm just reading from pronouns here, but Jesus in the context is the him or his. Spoke of him. He saw his glory.
Right.
The next verse is still talking about Jesus. So those pronouns all apply to Jesus.
So I believe the New Testament fully affirms that Jesus does appear in the Old Testament. He's always been the Son of God.
Yeah.
But there was a moment in time that he came into our world as a man.
Yeah.
And that he is definitely Yahweh. The third myth that many Christians believe is that the Old Testament clearly predicts Jesus everywhere. And Bart says that's absolutely not true. Jesus is not predicted anywhere in the Old Testament. And of course he says, well, when you read Matthew's all about this fulfillment theology, this fulfillment language. Yeah. Jesus fulfilled all these Old Testament prophecies. So I think we first need to talk about what does Matthew mean when he's talking about fulfillment. You might want to talk about typology a little bit.
Yeah, so we have to understand that there's oftentimes this language used when we're talking about the New Testament writers are just quoting what they know. They're referencing back to what they know. And they say, well, like this happened again, but it's truly happened. You know what I'm saying? Like Jesus born of a virgin, for example. Well, Isaiah 7 is talking about a real person born at a real time back in Isaiah's time. That's okay. But there's a typology here, and understanding that that word that's translated as virgin can mean maiden. It can mean, but it's someone who's not married and therefore has not, you know. And so then she has a child. There's a uniqueness to Jesus in Matthew, but Matthew is taking that and typologically applying it to Jesus.
Absolutely.
So he's not saying that Isaiah was saying this was Jesus in 7:14 of Isaiah, but he's saying, look what Jesus has done in such a greater way than, what's his name? My hair bow, how do you say it? Quick as a booty.
Speedy as the prey.
Speedy as the prey, yeah.
Marshallah-Hashbaz.
Yeah. So that Marshallah-Hashbaz is the one.
And he appears in chapter 8.
In chapter 8 of Isaiah.
Yeah.
So there's context that we have to keep in consideration that we see Jesus typologically all the time. Jesus is the better David. He's the better Moses. He's the better everything.
He's the better Israel.
He's the better Israel. And all of that's typological.
Just as in Hosea, God called Israel out of Egypt, right? God also called Jesus out of Egypt.
Right, and that's, Matthew uses that as well.
And that is also a typology.
Yeah, it's a typology. So that's okay. In fact, it's dishonest because this dude has read all this stuff enough to figure this out without just saying see, this is wrong.
That's right.
Like, he's actually educated. He has a PhD. He's written books on it, and yet he chooses to ignore evidence or actually accept that there could be logical and optional other options that are logical and for interpretation.
The fourth myth. There are no contradictions in the Bible. This is something that Christians believe, but it is a myth. So, I think we need to start by defining what a contradiction is.
Go for it.
You want me to go for it?
Yeah.
A contradiction is where two things do not agree with one another.
To what degree?
That's a good question.
Yeah.
Right? Because in the Bible, we do see variations, I would say, right? Such as Matthew at the tomb on Jesus' resurrection records 2 angels being present at the tomb, while Mark only records 1 angel. Now, Bart would say that's a contradiction. Matthew says 2, Mark says 1.
Yeah.
I say it's a variation. The reason I say it that way is because Matthew is his own person. He's writing his gospel. He's not writing Mark's gospel. Now, you might say he used some of Mark's gospel in his writings.
Or they had shared sources.
And that's fine, right? But Matthew has his own mind. He has his own experiences, just as Mark did. So, I don't see a problem or a contradiction there because people are free to write what they want to write. They don't have to be automatons where they have to agree at every point in the story because nobody reports things the same way.
Yeah, well, even if we're talking about groups of people, if you read the New Testament and you read about how the law was given, it doesn't say like, well, Moses and God were just up there hanging out, piling around by themselves. It says the law was mediated through angels.
Yes.
But Exodus doesn't give us all that information. Or it says in Deuteronomy that God buried Moses. But when we read Jude, Michael, the archangel, and Satan figure fought over the body of Moses.
Right.
So there's details that are different, and we all share details differently when we tell a story. And there's things that we might say from a 30,000 foot level, God did bury Moses' body. From the ground level, there was a fight over his body, right? Those are two different things. And so even, N.T. Wright would say, no one walked around with a tape recorder.
Right.
Also, Jesus probably preached what he preached, the same sermon, more than one time.
Yes.
So, like the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew says, blessed are the poor in spirit. But in Luke it says, blessed are the poor. Well, where did spirit go? This is common sense when we actually take into the perspective of what Logan was saying. Different writers, different experiences, different sources, different purposes.
Different themes,
different reasons. And essentially, they care about different details. That's human.
Yeah.
These men were human. They're, like you said, no one's automaton here. Yeah. So the idea of contradictions typically is rather silly, and almost every time you can harmonize the text together. One of the favorite contradictions is like Paul says, that it's faith alone, and then James says, faith without deeds is dead, and like they want to make those two go against each other, which is really silly when you actually read what they're writing in context.
Right.
Especially when you understand that you use language in different contexts, different conversations, in different places differently. And you can even use the same word to convey a completely different message. So depending on what you're trying to communicate. So the only thing that we can actually work with here is context. And if we disregard context, then we can make anything a contradiction. Like trying to harmonize the birth narratives in Matthew and Luke, if you ever read Bart or go look up Bart, what he says about those, it's impossible for these to be harmonized. Right. They're two different events.
Well, Bart really wants to push in on Christians because we say, this is the inspired Word of God. Yeah. And Bart says, well, if it's inspired, then surely he would make it where it wasn't no contradictions in there.
By whose standard?
Bart's standard.
By Bart's standard. Bart's standards of contradictions sometimes are rather silly. Yeah. And he's, in my opinion, embarrassing. But that's just my opinion. And Toby's opinion, just like Bart's opinion.
Another myth, number 5, Christians believe that contradictions in the Old Testament don't matter because the Old Testament doesn't matter for Christians. We're about the New Testament. Yeah. That's a myth that we believe. And other than like a select few people, I don't hear any Christians saying that.
I've never heard anything like that.
And there are some things in the Old Testament that make you scratch your head a little bit, such as King Jehoiakim, right? In 2 Kings 24, verse 8, he's 18 years old when he begins to reign. Yeah. But in 2 Chronicles 36, verse 9, he's 8 years old when he begins to reign. Right. Well, which one is it? Is he 8 or 18? More than likely, he's 18 because an 8-year-old's never going to be king. Unless
he's got a regent or something.
He's got a regent, someone to fill in his place until he comes of age.
That happens in the Old Testament.
It does happen. So whether you want to call that a contradiction or not, it's up to you.
You've got some textual corruptions in some of the Old Testament. There's times when, some of these
Sometimes
manuscripts...
people forget a letter.
They might, yeah. Hebrews also...
A scribal mistake.
There's all kinds of things. And so then we have to piece together the best we can the original manuscript. And then, sometimes Hebrew is just hard. It's a hard language. But we have a passage, who killed Goliath? David killed Goliath. There's a passage in, I believe, one of the Chronicles that says some other guy killed Goliath. Well, obviously, rather than saying, these were two accounts and the David account was made up, which is like what they would say, we said, well, actually, no, this is really easy. There's some real simple contextual issues with the Hebrew that makes sense that, no, this is not saying that this guy killed Goliath. Right. It's a textual corruption. And that's okay. We have enough to get by on what is accurate and what is inaccurate. We just have to realize that we don't have a perfect downloaded copy
Well,
of
I
the
would say this,
Hebrew.
unlike Mormons and unlike who else? Muslims, we actually have many biblical manuscripts
Oh, sure,
for the
sure.
Old Testament and the New Testament, and we're able to reconstruct both
Yeah,
fairly easy.
yeah.
So we have Dead Sea Scrolls for the Old Testament. You've got the Peshitta for the Old Testament. You've got the Masoretic text for the Old Testament. New Testament, we have thousands upon thousands of copies in different languages. And if we just had the church fathers alone, we would have enough probably to put together
Yeah.
most of the New
And
Testament.
one of
So
Ehrman's favorite arguments is to try to tell you that the Bible transmission is based upon like a game of telephone, which you've ever played the game of telephone.
Right.
He doesn't say this in this video, but he uses this illustration all the time. You know, if someone starts out with a phrase and you whisper it to the person next to you and it goes on down the line, and by the time it gets to the last person, it doesn't sound anything like it started with. Well, obviously, that is a rather childish and untrue way of how scribes worked, how copying worked, how memory works, how any of those things work.
right.
Especially when we're talking about like just for New Testament manuscripts, it's not just like there was a guy in a room with 10 other guys and they were copying it down and then they mailed it out to everywhere. No, we had the manuscripts were copied so quickly that then those started hubs of other copying locations. And so we can actually take these manuscripts came from Alexandria, these came from, Byzantium, and we can look at those and say, oh, wow, they're pretty much identical.
Yeah.
Yeah, there are discrepancies like, oh, this left off a definite article, or this left off a vowel, or this word is misspelled, or this line was skipped. But I'm sure if you've had to copy sentences at any time, you realize that sometimes that's not easy. But you have thousands of people doing this from many locations, and it's easy to harmonize the manuscripts. So the text of the Bible is pretty reliable, despite what Mr. Ehrman might say.
Number 6. There's only 8 of these. We're almost done.
Yeah.
Number 6. Most Christians believe that manuscript differences in the New Testament are insignificant.
Correct. Yeah. See, that's not a myth. Like, he has very little argumentation for this. I don't even think he gives an example.
You know,
Does
he
he give an example?
would give an example from Hebrews, but it's weak.
Yeah.
And so I don't hear any Christians talking about this. No Christian scholars say this.
No.
That they're insignificant. And the reason he gets that, the reason he says that is because most Christian scholars say there is not one doctrine that Christians believe that's affected by any differences in the New Testament manuscripts. And he says, well, there's still differences. They still matter. Do they?
Yeah, they matter. They matter in terms of like language. He would say language matters, words matter. But then he doesn't take his own advice. His
Right.
language matters. His words matter. And by veiling that in a conviction of like you don't care, he can cover up the fact that it's true. Like it's not a myth.
Yeah.
There is no blatant theological depth like that's going to wreck you or say Jesus isn't God or he didn't die on the cross or
He didn't
resurrect.
exist.
Yeah, none of that from textual variance. It's rather silly for him to take that position.
Again, it's his problem with
Yeah.
inspiration and preservation.
Sure.
Right. He wants a perfect Bible. He wants
guess.
original manuscripts. He wants everything to be without mistake or error.
Yeah.
And that's just not tenable.
Well, that's not tenable for almost anything in life.
Right.
But the thing is like that comes from the position in the end of skepticism to the place like, well, we can't know anything. But that statement in itself is actually knowledge, right? I don't know anything. Well, you know that. So when you investigate any kind of material, we do like an empirical method, right? The scientific method's based on this. Historical method's based on this. We recognize empirical data, which is just data in front of us, right? Real life data.
Right.
We are intelligent about it, which means we examine it, we inquire about it, we ask questions, and then we make a judgment on it. Everyone does this on everything. So skepticism in itself is okay to a certain level, but in the end, that in itself is a judgment. So everyone is making a judgment about something, and that judgment is called knowledge. So like, how do we get to insight and knowledge? Like, that's the real root of it. And he wants to undermine that as a process of how we learn and grow and know. Right. So I think that's one of his philosophical positions, undermine like even what he's trying to accomplish.
Right. I would agree. Number 7. One of the myths that Christian believes is that Paul and Jesus basically taught the same thing. Bart says that Jesus taught how one enters the kingdom of heaven is by keeping the commandments. That's what he told the rich young ruler. Yeah. But Paul taught that the law couldn't save anyone. The commandments are useless, and therefore it's only by faith in Jesus that you enter the kingdom.
So this is a horrible.
So can we go to the rich young ruler just real quick?
Sure.
Just see if that's even
my
true,
goodness.
right?
Yeah.
So when you go to Matthew chapter 10, real quickly here. Time is fleeting. But Matthew chapter 10, verses 17 through 22. I just want to read this for us. I believe it is. Is it Matthew 10? Mark 10. No, Mark 10. Almost messed up there. Mark 10.
Mark 10. That's how fast.
Verses 17 through 22. It says this, and he was setting out on a journey, and a man ran up to him and knelt before him and began asking him, "Good teacher, what shall I do to inherit eternal life?" And Jesus said to him, "Why do you call me good? No one is good except God alone. You know the commandments: do not murder, do not commit adultery, do not steal, do not bear false witness, do not defraud, honor your father and mother." And he said to him, "Teacher, I have kept all these things from my youth up." And looking at him, Jesus loved him and said to him, "One thing you lack. Go and sell all you possess and give to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven, and come, follow me." But at these words he was saddened, and he went away grieving, for he was one who owned much property. Did Jesus just tell this rich young ruler, just keep the commandments and you're good? No, what was the demand? Keep the commandments and follow me.
You can't have the Father without the Son.
You can't inherit the kingdom without following Jesus. So Jesus didn't teach just keep the commandments. He taught follow me.
No, that's
so that's a misrepresentation in and of itself.
100%. So like, he literally just takes out a phrase, and then to say that Paul
is the inventor of faith alone.
Yeah, that's crazy. When first of all, he's not even defining what the term faith means, which is like a phrase that goes all throughout. Like, Abraham believed, is what our texts say in most of our English Bible. He trusted in God, right? He trusted, and God attributed to him as righteousness. The onus of the Christian faith is trust. It's belief and loyalty. And then if you are a person who lives in trust and loyalty to Jesus, allegiance to Jesus, you will do what? Keep his commandments. Act like a good child of God.
So trust communicates commitment.
100%. And then that is lived out.
Absolutely.
And Paul, in no way, in any point, ever contradicts that. And Paul's argument about the law, because the law is good and holy, he says.
Romans 7.
Here's what he says. The powers of evil, the powers of sin and death, have taken something good and holy and tried to use it to destroy. They took the law and they tried to, like, what did I do? I wanted to follow the law. I was zealous about it. I cared about it. It was like the thing it was my thing. And then I murdered people.
Yes.
Right? What Paul denied Jesus. Paul denied the law, in a sense, because it was weaponized to destroy.
Self-vindication is what the law produces for Paul. Paul says, I could boast about all the things that I did as a Pharisee, and yet in the end, it was worthless to me.
Yeah, it was.
Because without trust in Jesus, it means nothing.
Yeah, it was weaponized to destroy him, and he used it and he took it. Yeah. And he was being destroyed until...
So Paul doesn't deny the commandments.
A radical intervention.
He doesn't deny the commandments.
No, never.
But he would deny that you can keep commandments without a relationship with Jesus and
Absolutely.
be good.
You have to have Jesus. You cannot have the Father without the Son.
Absolutely. The last one, number 8. The final myth that Christians believe. The Gospels are based upon eyewitness testimony, therefore they are reliable. Of According to Ehrman, this is a myth because the Gospels were not written by eyewitnesses.
Well, he would even say if they were, that's not reliable either, right? I mean, he would go so far to say, like, you ever read testimony and how they contradict and how they're different. The thing is like, it's not just eyewitness testimony. They have, of course, an oral tradition. These men, I believe, were eyewitnesses, not Luke, but Matthew, Mark, to some degree, who may have written from the recollections of Peter, and John, of course. But all throughout this, you negate the fact that, like, people wrote stuff down. Everyone had wax and clay tablets, and they would carve into them and keep notes, and there were secretaries and there were note takers. And you think that 12 dudes if they had a bookkeeper, you don't think they had a records keeper?
Well, I think this is an argument for silence, number one.
Oh, sure, yeah.
Because we do not possess any manuscripts that do not have Matthew, Mark, or Luke, or John on the
also
manuscript. True. So there is no manuscript that Mark can point to and say, this is the Gospel of John, but it doesn't bear the name of John.
Yeah, it's the only evidence we have. It's the only
right?
evidence we have.
And I think, I forgot who was the scholar that promoted this, but one scholar I read said that if a manuscript didn't have a name on it, no one would read it.
Yeah.
So the best assumption is these names were attached to these Gospels from the very beginning.
get-go, yeah.
From the beginning. And so why do we have reason to doubt that they were not written by the people that bared their name?
And then there's a British scholar named Richard Bauckham.
Yeah, Jesus and the
Eyewitnesses.
Eyewitnesses.
Literally a book called Jesus and the Eyewitnesses. And he goes through hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of, like, funerary inscriptions, ossuary boxes. He talks about geographical material to demonstrate, in comparison to, like, a lot of other, like, kind of gospels that books claim to be gospels, the names and the geography and everything listed could have only come from people who had an understanding of that time and place.
Yeah, absolutely.
And when you read other gospels, you'll see introductions of, like, a lack of knowledge of geography, right? A lack of knowledge of nomenclature.
A lack of knowledge of the historical Jesus.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
You read the Gospel of Peter, and when Jesus raises from the dead, so does his cross.
Yeah, the
and
cross
comes
it's
out
like
of the tomb.
It's a giant
it's
cross.
a giant cross, and it talks.
Yeah.
It's just absurd.
It's fan fiction.
It's fan fiction.
So, and there's a lot of fan fiction, and some of it is helpful, and some of it is crazy, right? But we have to call it for what it is. Yeah.
So it turns out that these myths that many Christians believe are not myths at all.
No.
In fact, they're very much true and can be validated pretty easy. And the reason this is important to me, anyways, is that a lot of misrepresentation in the world about Christianity and the Bible, and Bart, I believe, knows better, but despite his knowledge, he is against it.
Yeah, because Bart has rejected it, right? And his main deal is he can't deal with the problem of evil. He can't deal with a lot more. Maybe we'll talk about that at some point. But he can't deal with a lot of the things. He refuses to reconcile it, and he wants to be bitter about it. And he kind of looks like a character from Star Wars.
It's kind of like the saying that Greg Bonson once said, great apologist. Greg says, without God, you can't prove anything at all. I think that's very true.
Yeah,
you
that's
have
probably
no.
True.
Bart wants to justify his rejection of the faith, but in doing so, he has committed himself to absurdity.
Yeah, it's the beginning of knowledge, right? You have to know God.
Yeah.
And so therefore, Bart doesn't know God, and therefore he doesn't even know himself.
No.
Because you can't know yourself if you don't know God.
Absolutely. All right. Well, that's all the time that we have for today. Until next week, I'll see you later.